The sun was setting over Memphis, Tennessee, casting long shadows across the Shell gas station's worn concrete. The fluorescent lights had just flickered on, creating pools of harsh light that mixed with the warm orange glow of dusk. For Harold and Betty Washington, this gas station had been a familiar landmark for over 2 decades, a consistent pit stop on their monthly visits to see their grandchildren. Harold carefully guided their old Buick into the station, the car's navy blue paint showing its age but still gleaming from Betty's regular care. The couple had spent the weekend doing what they loved most, spoiling their 3 grandkids with homemade cookies, stories from the old days, and plenty of hugs. Betty was still chuckling about how their youngest grandson had tried to teach her to play something called Minecraft. "You know, honey," Betty said, adjusting her floral cardigan, "little David is growing up so fast. Remember when he could barely reach the kitchen counter?" Her soft voice carried the warmth of countless family gatherings. Harold nodded, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel as he parked next to pump number 4, their usual spot. The evening air was thick with humidity, typical for a late summer day in Tennessee. The smell of gasoline mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee drifting from the station's convenience store. Through the store's windows, they could see Mrs. Chen, the owner's wife, arranging fresh sandwiches in the display case. She'd often save them their favorite tuna salad sandwich when she knew they were coming through. Harold stepped out of the car, his movements careful but dignified. At 75, his joints weren't what they used to be, but he carried himself with the same pride he'd shown during his 40 years as a high school mathematics teacher. Betty watched him with affection, remembering how he'd looked in his first year of teaching, standing at the blackboard with chalk dust on his sleeve. "Need any help, dear?" Betty called out, already knowing his answer. Harold had always insisted on pumping the gas himself, a small act of chivalry he'd maintained throughout their 52 years of marriage. "I've got it, sweetheart," he replied with a gentle smile, the same one that had won her heart at a church picnic back in 1969. He reached for his wallet, the worn leather softened by decades of use. Inside was a faded photo of their wedding day, tucked behind his credit cards. The gas station was relatively quiet for this time of evening. A young mother was strapping her toddler into a car seat a few pumps over, while an elderly man in a pickup truck was paying inside. The routine familiarity of the scene made Harold feel at ease. This was their regular stop, their slice of normalcy on the drive home. Betty rolled down her window, letting in the evening breeze. She could hear crickets starting their nightly chorus from the small patch of grass behind the station. A bell chimed as someone entered the store, and the radio playing from the station's speakers switched to an old Motown song that took her back to their first apartment. Neither Harold nor Betty noticed the distant rumble of motorcycles growing louder. They were lost in the comfortable routine of their journey home, discussing whether they should stop by the grocery store for milk and whether their daughter-in-law had seemed tired. It was just another peaceful evening at their familiar gas station, until it wasn't. The peaceful scene was about to change dramatically, but in that moment, there was just an elderly couple, deeply in love, going about their evening routine. Harold finished entering his zip code into the pump's keypad, while Betty hummed along to the radio, both unaware that this ordinary stop would soon become anything but ordinary. The peaceful evening shattered as 3 thundering motorcycles roared into the gas station, their engines echoing off the concrete like angry beasts. The riders, wearing black leather jackets covered in patches that would make most people uncomfortable, circled the lot once before pulling up to the pumps across from Harold and Betty's car. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, cut his engine first. He was probably in his mid-40s, though years of hard living had left their mark on his face. His eyes, cold and calculating, immediately locked onto Harold as the elderly man tried to focus on the gas pump's display. Well, what do we have here?" The leader called out, his voice carrying a meanness that made Betty's hands tremble as she sat in the car. He nudged one of his companions, a shorter man with a shaved head who seemed to feed off his boss's energy. The third biker, younger than the others but trying hard to look tough, hung back slightly, though his smirk showed he was eager to prove himself. The evening air grew thick with tension. The young mother from earlier quickly hustled her toddler into their car and drove away. Inside the store, Mrs. Chen moved away from the windows, her hand reaching for the phone. Even the crickets seemed to quiet down, as if sensing the trouble brewing. "Just trying to get some gas," Harold said quietly, keeping his voice steady despite the fear building in his chest. He'd lived through the civil rights era, had seen this kind of hatred before, but somehow it still caught him off guard. His hand shook slightly as he tried to replace the gas cap. The bikers started moving, spreading out in a way that wasn't random at all. The leader took a few steps closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. "Seems like you folks are a little lost," he said, his words dripping with ugly suggestions. "This ain't your part of town." Betty watched through the car window, her heart pounding. She taught elementary school for 35 years, had dealt with all kinds of difficult parents and situations, but this was different. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, trying to remember the emergency number Harold's daughter had programmed for speed dial. The short biker with the shaved head started walking in a wide circle, his eyes never leaving Harold. "Maybe we should help them find their way home," he called out, making the young biker laugh. The sound was hollow and forced, like he was trying too hard to fit in with the others. Harold reached for his wallet, hoping to pay quickly and get out of there. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the cooling evening air. The wallet seemed heavier than usual, his fingers clumsy with anxiety as he tried to pull out his credit card. That's when the leader made his move. With a quick step forward, he knocked the wallet from Harold's hand, sending cash and cards scattering across the oil-stained concrete. "Oops," he said with a cruel smile. "How clumsy of you." A few other customers had pulled into the station, but they quickly turned their cars around when they saw what was happening. Through the store windows, people pretended to be very interested in their phones or the snack displays, carefully looking anywhere but at the scene unfolding outside. The scattered contents of Harold's wallet lay between him and the bikers like a sad map of his life. His driver's license, the Medicare card he just started using, the photo of his grandchildren at the beach last summer, and the few $20 bills he'd withdrawn for the trip. The evening breeze stirred the papers slightly, but nobody moved to pick them up. Betty's hands gripped her seatbelt, torn between staying safely in the car and going to help her husband. She could see Harold's shoulders tense up the way they did when he was trying to be brave, the same way he looked when he'd faced down budget cuts at his school or dealt with prejudiced parents during his teaching days. The sun had almost completely set now, the gas station's fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made everything look stark and dramatic. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with no one quite sure what would happen next. But someone was watching, someone none of them had noticed yet, and the next few moments would change everything. Harold kept his eyes down, focusing on a cracked line in the concrete as he tried to stay calm. He'd dealt with bullies before. Back in his teaching days, he'd learned that showing fear only made things worse. But this was different. These weren't misunderstood teenagers he could reach with patience and understanding. These were grown men choosing hatred. "Please," Betty called softly from the car, her voice carrying decades of dignity despite her fear. "We don't want any trouble." She clutched her phone, but her fingers trembled too much to dial. Through the windshield, she could see her husband standing alone, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. The leader of the bikers took another step forward, purposefully crushing Harold's scattered receipts under his heavy boot. "Hear that, boys? They don't want any trouble." His mock-gentle tone made his companion snicker. "Ain't that just the sweetest thing?" Inside the store, the few customers who remained were doing their best to become invisible. A teenage clerk stood frozen behind the counter, his hand hovering near the panic button, but too scared to press it. Mrs. Chen had disappeared into the back room, presumably calling for help, but the minutes seemed to stretch like hours. The short biker with the shaved head started kicking Harold's cards around like they were playing some sick game of street hockey. "Look what I found," he called out, snatching up Harold's Teacher of the Year photo ID from 1985. "We got ourselves an educator here. Bet you think you're real smart, don't you?" Harold's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in aggression, but in an effort to stop them from shaking. He thought about his grandchildren, about the talks he'd had to have with them, about staying safe in a world that sometimes showed its ugly side. He'd hoped things would be different for their generation. The youngest biker, perhaps sensing his chance to prove himself, stepped closer to Betty's side of the car. She quickly hit the lock button, the sharp click echoing in the tense air. The sound made him laugh, a harsh bark that held no real humor. "You know," the leader said, crossing his arms and looking down at Harold. "My daddy always told me that some folks need to be taught their place." He gestured around the gas station with a sweep of his arm. "And this ain't it." A car pulled into the station's entrance, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene, but quickly reversed and left when the driver saw what was happening. The flash of light caught the chrome on the bikers' motorcycles, making them gleam like bared teeth in the growing darkness. Betty watched as Harold slowly bent down to pick up his scattered belongings, his movements careful and deliberate. Her heart ached, remembering how he'd stood tall at their daughter's wedding, how he'd walked into board meetings with his head high, how he'd faced every challenge in their life together with quiet strength. The leader's boot came down again, this time inches from Harold's reaching hand. "Did I say you could pick those up?" he growled, all pretense of playfulness gone from his voice. The other two bikers moved closer, forming a tight circle around Harold. Through the car window, Betty could see the gas station's security camera slowly turning toward them. She prayed it was recording, that someone was watching, that help would come. The evening had turned the windows into mirrors, reflecting the scene back at her like some terrible movie she couldn't stop watching. Harold straightened up slowly, his back protesting the movement. He looked at the leader, not with anger or hatred, but with something like pity. "Son," he said quietly, using his teacher voice, the one that had calmed troubled students for 4 decades, "you're better than this." The words hung in the air for a moment, and something flickered across the leader's face, perhaps a memory of his own school days, or a flash of shame quickly buried. But then his expression hardened again, and he took a step forward, fists clenching. What nobody had noticed was the pickup truck parked in the shadows near the air pump, or its driver, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing concern. In the next moment, everything was about to change, but for now, time seemed frozen in that terrible instant before a storm breaks. In the shadowy corner of the gas station, beside the humming air pump, sat a dusty red pickup truck. Inside, James Martinez had been charging his phone and checking his messages when the bikers roared in. At first, he barely looked up. After 2 tours overseas as a marine surgeon, he'd learned to mind his own business. But something about the scene playing out before him set off familiar alarms in his mind. He watched the situation unfold through his windshield, his military training kicking in as he assessed the scene. 3 aggressors, 2 potential victims, multiple exit routes blocked. The elderly couple reminded him of his own grandparents, who'd faced similar situations back in their day. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes standing by is the same as standing with the wrong side. Martinez had spent enough time in combat zones to recognize the signs of impending violence. He saw it in the way the bikers moved, in their body language, in the calculated way they positioned themselves around their targets. His fingers drummed quietly on his steering wheel as he considered his options. Through his open window, he could hear snippets of their words, each one making his jaw clench tighter. The hatred in their voices was familiar. He'd heard it in different languages, in different countries, but it always sounded the same. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister, but he ignored it, his eyes fixed on Harold's straight back as the elderly man faced down his tormentors. The gas station's fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, creating deep shadows that reminded Martinez of night patrols. He noticed how the teenage clerk inside was frozen in fear, how Mrs. Chen had disappeared into the back room, likely calling the police. But response times could be slow, and situations like this could turn ugly in seconds. He watched Betty in the car, her hands clasped as if in prayer, and thought of his own mother back home. The sight of her fear made something shift inside him. Not the hot, quick anger he'd felt as a young Marine, but something cooler and more focused. He'd learned that true courage wasn't about rushing in with fists raised. It was about calculated action and controlled presence. The leader of the bikers was moving again, his boot deliberately grinding Harold's scattered belongings into the concrete. Martinez noticed how the younger biker kept looking to his leader for approval, how the shorter one seemed to feed off the situation's growing tension. Classic pack mentality. He'd seen it before, knew how to handle it. His trained eye caught other details too. The security cameras that might or might not be recording, the few witnesses pretending not to see, the way Harold kept himself between the bikers and his wife's car. The old teacher's courage was impressive. Martinez had seen decorated soldiers with less composure under pressure. The temperature had dropped as night settled in, but nobody seemed to notice. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Martinez saw the leader's hands clench into fists, saw the subtle shift in his stance that telegraphed his intentions. It was time to move. He reached for his phone, quickly opening the camera app and hitting record. Evidence first, another lesson learned the hard way. His other hand quietly opened the truck's door, the hinges silent thanks to recent oiling. He moved with the careful precision that had kept him alive in much more dangerous situations. None of the bikers noticed him yet. Their attention was fixed on Harold, who stood amid his scattered belongings with a dignity that made Martinez's chest tighten. The old man's refusal to be intimidated seemed to infuriate the bikers even more, and Martinez could see the situation balancing on a knife's edge. In the distance, a siren wailed, but it was too far away to matter right now. Martinez stepped out of his truck's shadow, moving with purpose but without hurry. He'd learned long ago that true power often lay in calm authority rather than brute force. His footsteps were silent on the concrete as he approached, his presence still unnoticed by the group ahead. The next few moments would decide everything, and Martinez was ready. He'd faced down worse odds in worse places, but somehow this felt more important. Because this wasn't about war or duty. It was about standing up for what's right in your own hometown. About not letting hatred win on a quiet evening at a simple gas station. The leader of the bikers had just taken another threatening step toward Harold when Martinez smoothly inserted himself into the scene. He didn't rush or shove. He simply appeared, like a shadow stepping into light, positioning himself between the elderly couple and their tormentors. His movement was so natural, so controlled, that it took everyone a moment to realize what had happened. The sudden change in the situation created a ripple of confusion. The leader, who had been mid-sentence in another cruel taunt, found himself staring at Martinez's broad shoulders instead of Harold's weathered face. The other two bikers shifted uncertainly, their practiced intimidation routine disrupted by this unexpected development. Martinez stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't speak right away, letting his presence sink in. Years of military training had taught him that sometimes silence could be more powerful than words. His eyes, steady and clear, met the leader's gaze without aggression but with unmistakable purpose. Behind him, Betty let out a small gasp of relief, while Harold remained dignified but watchful. The scattered contents of his wallet still lay around their feet, forgotten testimonies to how the evening had turned ugly. The gas station's lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete. Evening, Martinez finally said, his voice calm and measured, as if he were greeting neighbors at a barbecue. But there was steel beneath the courtesy, a quiet authority that made the youngest biker take a half step backward. "Looks like we have a situation here." The leader tried to recover his momentum, puffing up his chest. "This ain't your business, friend," he growled, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Something about Martinez's stance, the way he held himself, sent warning signals that even the biker couldn't ignore. "Actually," Martinez replied, reaching slowly into his pocket, "I think it is." He pulled out his phone, its screen glowing in the growing darkness. "I've been recording for the past few minutes. Interesting footage, especially the part about teaching people their place." His thumb moved over the screen. "Should I send it to the police now, or wait until they arrive?" "I called them right after I started recording." The shorter biker with the shaved head shifted his weight from foot to foot, suddenly looking less sure of himself. "Hey, boss, maybe we should," he started, but the leader cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You trying to cause trouble?" the leader demanded, but his words lacked their earlier menace. Martinez's calm presence seemed to be draining the power from their intimidation tactics, like air slowly leaking from a balloon. "No," Martinez answered simply. "I'm trying to prevent it." He gestured to the security cameras above them. "Those have been recording too. Hate crimes against elderly citizens carry federal charges these days. That's serious time." He paused, letting the information sink in. "And I've got a pretty clear picture of your club patches." Betty watched from the car as the entire mood began to shift. She saw how Martinez never raised his voice, never made a threatening move, but somehow commanded the entire scene. Harold stood straighter behind him, his dignity returning as the balance of power changed. The youngest biker was now openly backing away, his earlier bravado evaporating. In the distance, the wail of police sirens grew louder, no longer just background noise, but an approaching reality. The leader looked around, seemingly noticing for the first time how exposed they were, how many windows faced the gas station, how many cameras might be recording. "We were just leaving anyway," the leader muttered, trying to save face. But his attempt at casual dismissal fell flat in the face of Martinez's unwavering presence. The shorter biker was already heading back to his motorcycle, clearly eager to be gone. Martinez didn't move, didn't respond, just kept his position and his quiet gaze. He'd learned in the Marines that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to make sure it never started. The security camera above them turned slowly, its red light blinking like a watching eye, while inside the store, faces began to appear at the windows, phones raised to record what was happening. The evening air had grown cooler, but nobody felt the chill. Time seemed suspended in that moment, like a deep breath held too long, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. The leader's next move would determine whether this story would be about violence prevented or justice served. Martinez kept his voice low but clear, each word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, still recording with his phone. "You're going to leave, right now, and these folks are going to get home safely." His calm tone somehow made it sound less like a suggestion and more like stating simple facts. The leader's face twisted through several emotions: anger, uncertainty, and finally, a grudging recognition that the situation had slipped completely out of his control. The red and blue reflections of distant police lights were now visible at the far end of the street, growing stronger with each passing second. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The leader tried one last time, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Martinez's slight smile showed he heard similar threats in much worse places. "Actually, I do," Martinez replied evenly. "I've got your faces, your bike registrations, your club affiliations, and about 4 minutes of recorded harassment and attempted intimidation of elderly citizens. The police will have copies of everything before you start your engines. And if you ever come back here—" He let the sentence hang, unfinished but clear. The short biker was already on his motorcycle, adjusting his helmet with shaking hands. The youngest one kept looking between his leader and the approaching police lights, like a kid who'd suddenly realized he was in way over his head. Inside the store, Mrs. Chen had emerged from the back room, phone still in hand, watching through the window with others who'd finally found their courage. "This ain't over," the leader growled, but he was already backing toward his bike. His boots crunched over some of Harold's scattered papers, but this time the sound carried defeat instead of intimidation. "It is over," Martinez corrected him quietly. "It was over the moment you decided to bully an elderly couple just trying to get gas. You just didn't know it yet." He took one step forward, his movement casual but purposeful. "The only question is how it ends, with you leaving now or explaining yourselves to the police." Betty watched in amazement as the three bikers, who had seemed so terrifying just minutes ago, began to mount their motorcycles. The leader's face was red with humiliation, but something in Martinez's steady gaze kept him from trying anything else. The younger ones were already starting their engines, eager to be gone. Harold, still standing straight despite his trembling hands, spoke up. "Young man," he said to Martinez, his teacher's voice steady, "thank you for." Martinez raised a hand gently, never taking his eyes off the bikers. "Let's finish the thanks when they're gone, sir," he said respectfully. "Mrs. Washington, are you all right?" He called to Betty, showing he'd been aware of everything happening around him. The roar of motorcycle engines filled the air as the bikers prepared to leave. The leader glared at Martinez one last time, trying to memorize his face, but Martinez just continued recording calmly. "The police have a clear view of those plates," he reminded them, his voice carrying over the engine noise. Inside the store, people were pressing against the windows now, phones out, recording everything. The teenage clerk had finally found the courage to push the panic button, adding a shrill alarm to the growing sound of police sirens. The gas station's security cameras continued their slow sweep, capturing every moment. The bikers finally pulled away, their tail lights disappearing into the gathering darkness. They left behind tire marks on the concrete and Harold's scattered belongings, but their intimidating presence had evaporated like morning dew. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had felt like hours to everyone involved. Martinez kept recording until the last motorcycle was out of sight. Only then did he lower his phone, his shoulders relaxing slightly but his eyes still alert. The police were less than a block away now, their sirens growing louder. The evening air felt lighter somehow, as if a storm had passed without breaking. Around them, the gas station began to come back to life. Car doors opened as people emerged from their hiding places, some looking ashamed at their earlier inaction, others relieved that the situation had been resolved without violence. The next few moments would be about picking up pieces, both literal and figurative. But the immediate danger had passed, transformed by one person's quiet courage. As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, the gas station seemed to let out a collective breath. Martinez turned his attention to Harold's scattered belongings, kneeling down to carefully gather the items that had been kicked around and stepped on. The elderly teacher's wallet was scuffed but intact, the family photos inside only slightly creased at the corners. "Let me help you with that, sir," Martinez said softly, picking up Harold's Medicare card from near the gas pump. Other people began emerging from the store and their cars, some looking guilty about their earlier inaction, others rushing to offer assistance now that the danger had passed. Betty stepped out of the car, her legs still shaking slightly. A young woman who'd been hiding in her SUV brought over a bottle of water, while Mrs. Chen hurried out with a chair from the store. Sit," the store owner insisted, patting Betty's shoulder. "You must be so shaken up." Harold knelt beside Martinez, his weathered hands trembling less now as they collected his scattered receipts and cards. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been teaching for over 40 years, and I've learned that sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the classroom." He looked at Martinez with grateful eyes. "Thank you for teaching those men one of those lessons." The police cars pulled into the station, lights flashing but sirens now silent. 2 officers stepped out, approaching professionally but relaxed once they assessed the situation. Martinez stood up slowly, foam still in hand, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I've got video of the whole incident," he explained to the officers, his voice steady and clear. Around them, other witnesses finally stepped forward, phones raised to show their own recordings. The teenage clerk emerged from the store with the security footage already pulled up on the computer system. "They were so brave," a woman said, pointing to Harold and Betty. "The way they kept their dignity even when—" She trailed off, wiping her eyes. Her young daughter clutched her hand, watching the scene with wide eyes, perhaps learning her own lesson about courage and standing up for what's right. The gas station's fluorescent lights continued their steady hum as statements were taken and evidence was gathered. More people from nearby businesses had wandered over, drawn by the commotion and police lights. The story was already spreading through the small crowd. How an elderly couple had faced down hatred, and how a quiet stranger had stepped in to help. "Never seen anything like it," the teenage clerk told anyone who would listen. "He didn't throw a single punch, didn't even raise his voice. But those bikers—" He shook his head in amazement. They just knew they were beaten. Betty had regained some of her color, sipping the water while Mrs. Chen hovered nearby with concern. "You know what amazes me?" she said to her husband. "How history repeats itself. When we were young, it was other people who stood up for us. Now here we are, all these years later." Harold squeezed his wife's hand, his teacher's instincts taking over. "But that's how change happens," he said. "One person stands up, then another and another. Like dominoes falling in reverse, building something instead of knocking it down." Martinez stayed quietly in the background as he finished giving his statement to the police. He'd learned in the Marines that true heroes don't seek the spotlight. But he couldn't help smiling as he watched the community come together. Strangers offering support, sharing their stories, turning a moment of darkness into something brighter. The evening had grown properly dark now, the gas station's lights creating a bright island in the night. Cars began pulling away, but not before their drivers exchanged numbers with Harold and Betty, offering to be witnesses if needed. Mrs. Chen insisted on giving everyone free coffee, turning the moment into something almost celebratory. What had started as an ugly confrontation had transformed into a reminder of the good in people. The security cameras kept their silent watch overhead, having captured not just an attempted act of hatred, but also its defeat at the hands of quiet courage and community support. The night was young, and this story was still unfolding. A week later, the same gas station looked completely different in the bright morning sunlight. New security cameras gleamed from updated positions, their presence more visible and reassuring. Mrs. Chen had posted a large "Everyone Welcome Here" sign in her window, decorated with hand-drawn flowers by neighborhood children. The story had spread through the community like wildfire, thanks to the multiple cell phone videos that had captured the incident. Local news vans were parked across the street, their reporters preparing for a special segment. Harold and Betty stood near pump number 4, their usual spot, but this time they were surrounded by supporters and well-wishers. "I still can't believe how fast everything happened," Betty told the young reporter who held a microphone carefully between them. She wore her best Sunday dress, the one with tiny purple flowers, and her silver hair was neatly styled. "One minute we were just getting gas, and the next—" She paused, squeezing Harold's hand. Harold picked up the story, his teacher's voice carrying clearly. "The next minute, we were reminded that for every person who wants to spread hate, there are dozens more ready to stand against it." He looked over at Martinez, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, trying to avoid the cameras. The police had worked quickly, using the video evidence to identify the bikers. Their motorcycle club, embarrassed by the negative attention, had publicly condemned their actions and revoked their memberships. The leader and his companions had been arrested 2 days after the incident, their tough guy attitudes crumbling in the face of multiple hate crime charges. "It wasn't just me," Martinez insisted when the reporters finally cornered him. He wore simple civilian clothes, his military background only visible in his straight posture and alert eyes. Everyone who recorded the incident, everyone who came forward as witnesses, everyone who's shown support since then, they're all part of this story. The gas station had become something of a symbol in the community. People went out of their way to fill up there, to buy coffee from Mrs. Chen, to show that hate wouldn't win in their neighborhood. The teenage clerk had been promoted to assistant manager, partly for his handling of the situation and partly for the anti-bullying program he proposed for local schools. You see, Harold explained to a group of students who'd come to interview him for their school newspaper, courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like Mr. Martinez showed us. Sometimes it's just standing your ground with dignity. And sometimes, he smiled at the young faces around him, it's deciding which side of history you want to stand on. Betty had started a community outreach program, working with local churches and community centers to promote understanding between different groups. The young mother who'd brought her water that night was now one of her most active volunteers. We're turning a moment of darkness into years of light, Betty told anyone who would listen. Mrs. Chen's security footage had gone viral online, not for the confrontation itself, but for what happened after, the way the community had come together, the quiet strength of Martinez's intervention, the dignity of the elderly couple. Comments poured in from around the country, many sharing similar stories of standing up against hatred. The city council had scheduled a ceremony to honor Martinez, despite his protests that he'd only done what anyone should do. That's exactly why we need to recognize it, the mayor had insisted. To remind everyone that this is what anyone should do. Local businesses had pitched in to install better lighting around the gas station, and a neighborhood watch program had sprung up spontaneously. The young woman who'd been too scared to help that night now led evening safety patrols, turning her regret into positive action. As the morning's interviews wrapped up, Harold noticed a group of bikers pulling into the station. For a moment, the crowd tensed, until they recognized the patches of a different club, one known for its community service and charity rides. They'd come to show support and to make it clear that not all bikers stood for hatred. The gas station had become more than just a place to fill up tanks. It had become a reminder that community could triumph over division, that courage could wear many faces, and that sometimes the darkest moments could lead to the brightest changes. 1 month after the incident, the gas station hosted a community celebration. Colorful balloons danced in the autumn breeze, and the smell of grilled hot dogs and hamburgers filled the air. Mrs. Chen had transformed her small convenience store into a buffet station, with homemade dishes brought by neighbors creating a feast that represented every culture in the community. The 3 men who had caused all the trouble were facing serious charges, with their court dates set for the following month. But today wasn't about them. It was about celebrating how a community had come together in response to hatred. The station's new sign proudly declared Unity Corner, a name suggested by one of Harold's former students. I never thought I'd be famous for buying gas, Harold joked to the gathered crowd, standing at a small podium decorated with paper flowers. Betty sat nearby, beaming with pride as her husband spoke. But what happened here wasn't really about gas, or about me and my wife, or even about those men who tried to intimidate us. It was about choosing what kind of community we want to be. Children played tag between the gas pumps, their laughter mixing with the music from a local church choir. Parents watched without worry, knowing that the entire neighborhood now kept a protective eye on this space. The teenage clerk, now assistant manager, supervised a group of high school volunteers who were painting a Unity mural on the station's back wall. Martinez stood at the edge of the celebration, characteristically trying to avoid attention. But people kept finding their way to him, sharing stories of times they wished they'd stood up, or asking advice about handling difficult situations. He listened patiently, offering the same quiet wisdom that had diffused the confrontation. The real heroes, Martinez told a group of eager Boy Scouts, are the ones who make small choices every day. The person who speaks up when they hear something wrong. The kid who sits with someone eating lunch alone. The neighbor who checks on an elderly couple. He gestured to the crowd around them. This is what America looks like when we choose to be our best selves. The city council ceremony to honor Martinez had turned into something bigger. They'd established a Community Courage Award, with Martinez as the first recipient. But instead of accepting it alone, he'd insisted on sharing it with Harold and Betty, and with Mrs. Chen, who'd immediately called the police that night. You know what's funny? Betty said to a group of women helping her arrange more food on the tables. Those men thought they were teaching us a lesson about our place in this community. She smiled, watching children of all backgrounds playing together. And they did, just not the lesson they intended. Local businesses had turned out in force to support the celebration. The auto shop across the street offered free safety checks. The diner down the block provided coffee and donuts. Even the competing gas station sent representatives with gift cards for their stores. Competition had given way to cooperation in the face of something more important. The young mother who'd brought Betty water that night now ran a weekly community meeting at the station. They discussed everything from neighborhood safety to planning holiday celebrations, but mostly they just got to know each other better. It's harder to hate someone once you know their story, she often said. As the celebration continued, Harold gathered a group of his former students who'd come to show support. When I was teaching, he told them, I always said that education doesn't just happen in classrooms. Life teaches us lessons every day. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn them. Martinez finally agreed to say a few words at the crowd's insistence. He walked to the podium, his quiet presence drawing everyone's attention just as it had that night. People keep calling me a hero, he said simply. But heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they're teachers who've spent their lives shaping young minds. Sometimes they're store owners who stand up for their customers. Sometimes they're ordinary people who simply refuse to look away when something wrong is happening. The celebration lasted well into the evening. As the sun set, the new lighting system cast a warm glow over the scene. The gas station had transformed from a place of fear into a symbol of hope, a reminder that darkness only prevails when light refuses to shine. The story of what happened there would be told and retold, not just as a tale of standing up against hatred, but as proof that a community united could overcome any challenge.